The morning mist hung thick over the trees of Normandy, France, on August 17, 1944. It was just before sunrise, and inside the Sherman tank, every breath felt louder than it should. Sergeant Franklin Daw, a 25-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio, had been staring through a strange-looking device for the past 10 minutes. It wasn't standard Army equipment. In fact, it looked more like something you'd find at a school science fair, a long, thin optical tube bolted at an odd angle onto the turret hatch. Just yesterday, his crew had laughed at it and called it Frank's upside-down periscope. But now no one was laughing. Frank whispered into the intercom, "Stay still. It's out there somewhere near the orchard line." His tank sat perfectly still, hidden in a ditch beside a narrow forest road just outside the village of South Silos. The Americans believed a German Panther tank was moving through the area, one of the most feared tanks in all of northern France. Inside the cramped Sherman, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and tension. Corporal Joe Harrison, the driver, gripped the controls like his life depended on it. Sam Miller, the gunner, kept one hand on the elevation wheel and the other on the trigger. Ralph "Tiny" Gibson, the loader, held a .75 Michelle in his arms like it was a newborn baby. Then Frank saw it, a faint flash of metal moving behind the hedgerow, barely visible through the reversed lenses of his homemade periscope. Not headlights, not infantry. Something bigger. "Target 3 o'clock, he whispered again. "It's a Panther." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Panther tank, officially the Panzerkampfwagen V, was faster, better armored, and carried a gun powerful enough to pierce a Sherman from over 1,000 yards away. Frank knew the odds. Everyone inside the tank knew them too, but no one moved. Because Frank's strange invention, the one they had teased him about for days, had just given them one priceless advantage: the first shot. He leaned back from the scope and spoke in a steady voice. "Doc, take the shot when I give the word. Tiny, stay low. Joe, engine off." He listened carefully, counting the seconds between the rustling of the leaves. Then, barely louder than the whispering forest, he said, "Now." Before he became Sergeant Daw, commander of 2nd Platoon, 72nd Armored Battalion, Franklin Eugene Daw was just a tall, skinny kid from the working-class streets of Cleveland, Ohio. Born in 1919, he was raised by his widowed mother and 2 older sisters. He spent more time tinkering with scrap metal and broken radios than playing with other kids. By 16, he could build a working carburetor from lawnmower parts. By 18, he once wired a telescope to a rifle sight just to see what would happen. His high school principal once wrote on his record, "Imaginative, persistent, unorthodox, a bright mind, poorly suited for rules." When America entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Frank didn't hesitate. He enlisted the very next day. Not because of patriotism, as he later admitted, but because he was bored. "I figured if I'm going to die someday," he told a friend, "I'd rather die moving forward than standing still." Basic training didn't love him, and the feeling was mutual. He questioned orders, modified equipment without permission, and once rigged his bunk like a drawbridge to avoid nighttime inspections. But there was something about the way he thought, sharp, creative, and unlike anyone else, that made him stand out. The Army didn't know where to place him, so they sent him to tank school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's where he met his future crew. Joe Harrison, the reckless driver from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Sam "Doc" Miller, a physics teacher turned gunner, and Ralph "Tiny" Gibson, a 6'3", 250-pound loader who once wrestled a mule in a bar fight. They called themselves Ghost Baker, a name that began as a joke because they had a habit of disappearing from radar during training, only to reappear exactly where they were needed. Under Frank's leadership, they lived up to that name. They didn't fight loud, they fought smart. By the end of July 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day, they landed in Normandy. Frank had already earned a reputation, part mechanic, part mad scientist, and completely determined to keep his crew alive. He had one rule: if something gave them an edge and didn't blow up in their faces, they would try it. His men didn't always understand his ideas. They followed him until the day he introduced the upside-down periscope. After that, some of them wondered if Frank had finally lost his mind. Sherman versus Panther. To understand why Frank was obsessed with finding panthers before they found him, you must know what facing one meant. On paper, it wasn't a fight. It was a death sentence. The American M4 Sherman, Frank's tank, was classed as a medium tank. It weighed about 33 tons and had a 75 mm gun. It was fast and reliable, built like a Ford pickup. That was no accident. It was made for mass production. By the end of the war, the U.S. had built more than 49,000 Shermans. Volume was a strategy. Still, Shermans were often badly outmatched. The German Panther, the Panzerkampfwagen V, was technically a medium tank too, but in German hands it was something else. The Panther weighed nearly 45 tons. It mounted a long 75 mm WK-42 gun that could rip a Sherman apart from over 1,000 yards. Its front armor was sloped and up to 8 mm thick, making it nearly invulnerable from the front. Its optics were sharper, its gun longer. Inside, the Panther was like a sniper rifle. To crews like Frank's, a Panther was more than a tank. It was a hunter. American doctrine reflected that cruel fact. Shermans were ordered to avoid Panthers when possible, to outnumber them, flank them, or call for artillery or air support. Charging a Panther head-on was almost suicide. Frank knew this. The whole Ghost Baker crew knew it. They had seen burned-out Shermans by hedgerows, turrets blown off, roofs peeled back, metal carcasses still smoking. In tank-to-tank fights, Panthers were precise, silent, sudden, and brutal. But the Panthers were not perfect. They were heavy, often too heavy. Their complex suspensions and transmissions tended to break on rough ground, especially in Normandy's woods and hills. They were slow to turn. Their supply lines were thin. Most importantly, they were not common. Germany produced fewer than 6,000 Panthers during the war. They were formidable, yes, but rare. Frank focused on those weaknesses. "You can't beat a Panther head-on," he once told his crew. "But if you see it first, you don't have to shoot twice." So while other commanders relied on speed or brute force, Frank fought differently. He used surprise, geometry, and small changes to the field, sandbags for armor, mufflers to quiet the engine, and yes, a reversed periscope. In a fight where seconds could save your life, seeing first mattered most. Frank's upside-down periscope came to him in one of those quiet, jittery moments between missions, when the fighting had stopped but the fear hadn't. They were parked outside an old farm near Lebedny Boys, fixing a track for the third time that week. The sun was setting, and long orange shadows fell across the fields. Then Frank saw it, a broken German field scope half buried in the muck near the trees, likely left behind in a messy retreat. It was cracked, but the optics still worked. He turned it over in his hands and checked the inner angles. An idea sparked. What if he mounted the lens backward? Back at camp, using leftover brackets, rubber tubing from a damaged fuel line, and part of a downed Luftwaffe radio antenna, Frank began to assemble something no Sherman had used before: a field-made reversed periscope. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't stable, but it gave him something manuals and officers couldn't: a new angle on the battlefield. Not everyone was impressed. When Frank first showed the device to his crew, Joe laughed. "You'll get us killed with that thing," he said. Tiny joked about tinfoil hats. Doc, half physicist, half skeptic, asked straight out, "Frank, why not keep your head like a regular man?" Frank didn't answer with a joke. He only said, "Because if you stick your head out, you'll get killed." He wasn't wrong. In Normandy, thick hedgerows turned every road into a trap. German snipers and anti-tank teams watched the hedges and waited for turret heads to appear. Even a moment of exposure, Just a glimpse of a helmet could mean instant death. Frank had seen it happen before, but no one above him seemed to care about his solution. When he officially asked for permission to install his new periscope, his commanding officer shook his head and said, "This isn't a science fair, Doc. Follow the manual." But Frank didn't. Over the next few days, he made the device stronger using bolts from a wrecked Jeep and added a rubber gasket to steady the view. He adjusted the mirror angle to match the turret's tilt and built a small pivot so he could scan without turning the tank. It wasn't perfect. The image was upside down, and staring too long gave him headaches, but it worked. Most importantly, it kept him alive. The idea might have sounded crazy, but it came from cold, hard logic. In tank combat, the one who fires first usually wins, and the one who hesitates rarely survives. Still, the jokes kept coming. Someone from another platoon called it Frank's fancy toilet paper roll. Another accused him of wasting time instead of checking the fuel lines. Even his own crew, though loyal, weren't sure this odd gadget would make any real difference in battle. But Frank believed in it, not because it was fancy, not because it was approved, but because if it gave his crew even 5 seconds of advantage, that could mean the difference between going home in the Sherman or in a box. Intelligence reports and the night of the ambush. By mid-August 1944, Normandy's hellish hedgerows were thinning out. The Americans were pushing east, the Germans were falling back, but nothing was certain. Every town they captured came with a cost. Every forest they entered could be their last. And it was in one of these forests, on the outskirts of southern silos, that Frank's strange invention would finally prove itself. The day began like any other: engine checks, refueling, half-warm rations, and that constant background hum of fear. Around noon, a courier arrived from battalion headquarters with new intelligence. The message was short and chilling. Enemy armor spotted near Route Dermont 225, likely Panther class. 2 vehicles moving east, heavily camouflaged, possible counterattack. The coordinates were less than 3 miles from Ghost Baker's position. That night, under a pale half-moon and the dull thunder of distant artillery, Frank's platoon received orders. Take a position at a wooded crossroads north of the town. Their mission: stop any German tanks trying to slip south and hit an American supply convoy. It was supposed to be routine. It never was. Frank personally picked their spot, a narrow trail cutting through dense forest that opened into a small clearing beside an abandoned orchard. The trees gave them natural cover. The trail formed a choke point, and the orchard gave him a perfect line of sight. He parked Ghost Baker in a shallow depression between 2 hedgerows. Engines off. Whispered voices. Guns are checked again and again. No fires, no lights, no talking. For 5 long hours, they waited in silence. And then something strange happened, the kind of stillness that only comes before chaos. The joke stopped. The doubts faded. Even the nickname, toilet paper roll, was forgotten. Inside the tank, everyone, consciously or not, began looking at that odd little device on the turret, not with laughter, but with hope. Frank used it like a violinist tuning his instrument: slow movements, gentle adjustments, scanning back and forth along the tree line. Every 30 seconds, he paused to recalibrate the optics. Every 10 minutes, he wiped the lens with his sleeve. No one spoke, but they watched him. And somehow, in that dim red interior light, the device didn't seem ridiculous anymore. It felt essential. At around 400 hours, 4 in the morning, Frank froze. His breath caught. Movement just beyond the orchard. Not infantry, not a supply truck. Something heavier. Low, deliberate, methodical. Through his backward-mounted periscope, he saw it, the faint glint of a German tank's observation slit sliding between the trees. A panther, less than 200 meters away, creeping forward through the woods, turret sweeping side to side. Frank whispered, "Panther 2 o'clock, hold position." In most tanks, this is where panic begins. Someone shouts, someone moves too fast, someone opens a hatch too soon. But not in Ghost Baker. They had drilled for this moment. Frank had prepared them. Joe killed the ignition. Sam slowly rotated the gun. Sam loaded a small, high-velocity armor-piercing round and locked it in. Frank kept his eyes on the target. The Panther had reached the edge of the trail. It hadn't seen them, not yet. Its turret was turning, exposing its side armor. Another few steps, and it would disappear behind the next row of trees. Frank had only seconds to decide. If they fired and missed, the Panther would fire back, and at that distance, the Sherman's armor might as well be paper. But if they waited too long, the opportunity would vanish. Frank's voice broke the silence. "Doc, line up the shot fire." The Sherman roared. The .75 Michelle screamed across the clearing and slammed into the Panther's midsection. A flash, a burst of smoke. Then silence. No explosion. No return fire. "Reload," Frank shouted. Tiny slammed in the next round. Sam fired again. This time, the shell hit right at the turret ring. The Panther shuddered. Flames shot out of the top hatch. Its engine screamed, then died. Within 30 seconds, it was still. The battlefield went dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. No engine noise, no footsteps, only the faint groan of cooling metal and the crackle of something burning far away. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke, not because they were calm, but because their minds hadn't yet caught up with what they'd done. They had killed a Panther. Frank blinked several times, still staring through the cloudy lens of his makeshift periscope. As the morning breeze pushed the smoke aside, the German tank's full shape came into view, frozen in death like an animal caught mid-leap. The right track was blown off, half the turret charred black. One hatch hung open, swinging gently, as if someone inside had tried to escape but never made it. Sam was the first to speak. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "we actually did it." Frank didn't answer. He just stared, not with pride, not yet, but with something heavier. He'd seen Panthers before. He'd seen them crush friendly tanks with just 2 or 3 good shots. He'd seen what was left afterward, the burned-out holes, the blackened bodies, the turrets blown apart. But this was the first time he'd watched one fall by his own hands. Ralph Little, Gibson pulled off his helmet, running a trembling hand through his hair. He was usually the joker, always ready with a one-liner. Now he couldn't speak. Driver Joe reached forward and gently tapped the dashboard, as if to thank the machine that had obeyed perfectly and kept them alive. Finally, Frank turned away from the periscope. "Reload," he said quietly. "Sir," Tiny asked, "we only saw one." "That doesn't mean there's not another," Frank replied. Without another word, Tiny nodded and began reloading another armor-piercing shell. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Nothing. The light grew stronger, the smoke thinned, and their kill became sharper, more defined in the morning sun. Only then did the crew begin to process what had happened, not just as soldiers, but as men. The Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol, a legend, a rolling death sentence marked with a black cross. Taking one down wasn't just a tactical victory. It was personal. It proved that legends could be wrong, that maybe, just maybe, the strange inventor everyone laughed at had seen something no one else did. Frank didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He slowly opened the top hatch and climbed halfway out into the morning light. What he saw hit him like a punch to the chest. The Panther wasn't alone. About 40 yards behind it, half hidden under branches and camouflage netting, was a second tank, another Panther. It wasn't moving. It had been abandoned. When the first one was hit, its crew must have bilayed out. Maybe they thought it was an ambush. Maybe they didn't want to die inside a steel coffin. Either way, they were gone. Frank climbed down and motioned for the others. One by one, they stepped out, staring in disbelief. The first Panther's main gun was still pointed at them, a silent threat that would never fire again. Joe knelt beside the wreck and looked up at the others. "I can't believe this was real," he said softly. Sam ran his hand along the side of the Sherman. "You know what saved us?" he asked. Everyone already knew the answer. Frank's periscope. The same thing people had once laughed at, dismissed, and called another one of his strange experiments. That odd-looking contraption had seen the Panther before the Panther saw them. It lets them aim first. It let them fire first. It let them live. Frank didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He just muttered softly, mostly to himself. "See first, win first." Later that day, a recon unit from battalion headquarters came to inspect the area. When they saw the smoking Panther and the Sherman that had destroyed it, they asked the same question everyone else would later ask. How? The crew didn't explain, not completely. They just shrugged and said, "Guess we got lucky." But inside Ghost Baker, they knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was geometry, preparation, nerves, and one man who refused to listen when others told him his idea was stupid. The tank hadn't defeated the Panther. A man had, a man who refused to stop thinking. The legend of Ghost Baker had begun. By the time sunlight broke through the forest canopy, word had already spread. A single Sherman had taken down a Panther, alone. No artillery, no air support, no luck. Just 5 men, 1 shell, and a homemade invention no one had ever seen before. Ghost Baker wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a story. That afternoon, the recovery team took photos, not just of the Panther's wreckage, but of the Sherman that had done it. The tank's bow was still scorched, its lower hull covered in mud. The crew stood straight for the picture, their faces dirty, helmets pushed back, expressions unreadable. A few miles behind the front, in a temporary briefing tent, the battalion commander asked Frank to explain how they'd pulled it off. Frank didn't give a speech. He didn't draw diagrams. He simply took the periscope off his tank, placed it on the folding table, and said one sentence. The room fell silent. An officer leaned forward and whispered, "This thing's homemade." Frank nodded. The commander studied the device, uneven metal, burn marks on the sides, lenses slightly warped from vibration. It looked more like a plumbing accident than military hardware. But it worked, and no one could argue with the results. There was no official announcement, not right away. The Army wasn't known for rewarding creativity that broke protocol. But in the barracks, around campfires, in nervous laughter between shellings, Frank's name began to spread. Some called him the Crazy Mechanic. Others nicknamed him Doc Frankenstein. But to most, especially within his platoon, he became the man who saw first. And slowly the tone changed. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was respect. Soldiers from other Sherman crews came asking questions. Could he build another one? What materials had he used? Was it hard to install? Frank showed them how it worked, warned them about the headaches from the reversed image, and even offered to help build more if he had the time. One young lieutenant, barely 20, said to him, "I used to think all this tinkering was a waste of time. Now I think you might outlive us all." Frank didn't laugh. He just looked at his hands stained with oil, blistered, trembling slightly, and replied, "I'm not trying to live forever. I'm just trying to see tomorrow." Inside Ghost Baker, things changed too. Where there used to be teasing, there was now trust. Tiny started calling the periscope Old Reliable. Doc began drawing plans to improve its field of view. Joe, who once joked about being buried in that steel coffin, now checked the optics before even starting the engine. What they had once seen as a lucky moment became something much bigger, not just fame, but a shift in mindset. They were no longer running from fear. They were chasing the next fight. That quiet change, that inner realignment, was something no manual could teach. It only came from experience, from surviving the impossible, from realizing that sometimes the craziest man in the room is the only one who's right. In the days that followed, the legend of Ghost Baker grew. Other units joked about installing a Frank scope on their own tanks. One platoon even painted a periscope symbol on the side of their tank as a tribute. Frank never asked for recognition. He didn't want attention. But the story spread anyway, because in a war defined by mass production, standard issue, and assembly lines, one handmade invention had changed the course of a deadly morning. And everyone knew stories like that don't stay secret for long. The battle in that forest wasn't the end. The war raged on through France, across the Rhine, until May 1945, when the Allies finally brought Nazi Germany to its knees. For Frank Dawes and the crew of Ghost Baker, something changed that day near Calvados. Something ended. They still faced danger every single day. They still lost friends. They were still afraid. But after that morning, they carried something new into every battle: proof. Proof that survival was possible. Proof that impossible wasn't always true. Proof that ideas, even strange ones, could be as powerful as weapons. Frank survived the war. So did Joe, Sam, and Tiny. They all made it home in one piece, though none of them ever truly felt the same again. Frank never asked for medals. He never wrote a book. He never gave interviews or made speeches at reunions. He worked quietly as a mechanic, lived a simple life, and kept the periscope in a dusty box in his garage. For years, he never spoke about the war, not to his family, not to his neighbors, not even to the men who'd shared that cramped Sherman tank with him. But decades later, when his teenage grandson, curious about history, asked him what it felt like to face and defeat a Panther tank, Frank finally answered. He didn't talk about tactics. He didn't talk about killing. He just said quietly, "It's not about killing the monster. It's about not letting the monster stop you from thinking." That was the legacy he left behind. In a war that demanded obedience, Frank chose imagination. In a machine built to follow orders, he introduced innovation. And in a world that often praised strength over subtlety, he proved that sometimes the smallest adjustment, the simplest idea, can save 5 lives and echo for generations. The upside-down periscope wasn't a revolutionary design. It didn't change the course of World War II. It didn't win a campaign. But on one cold morning in Normandy, it changed the fate of 5 men. It turned laughter into respect, doubt into action, and fear into determination. The lesson isn't just military, it's human. Trust your instincts. Follow your ideas, even when people laugh. Especially when they laugh. Because progress doesn't always look like a blueprint. Sometimes it looks like a pile of scrap metal, a few bolts from a Jeep, and a soldier who refused to stop building, even with death staring him in the face. There's something quietly heroic about someone who doesn't wait for permission to do what's right. Frank Dawes wasn't a general. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't lead a charge, plant a flag, or give a speech with an orchestra behind him. Inside a steel box, deep in the forest, he was just a man trying not to die. But maybe that's where real courage lives, not in grand gestures, but in small, unseen choices. The choice to tinker with a fragile idea while others sleep. The choice to believe in something no one else understands. The choice to trust your gut, even when your own crew rolls their eyes. Frank's story reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from engineers or think tanks. Sometimes it comes from a man with grease under his nails and too much time in a war zone. Sometimes it comes from need, from fear, from the desperate drive to survive one more day. But deeper than that, this story reminds us of something even more important. Every breakthrough, every small advantage that helps us survive, doesn't start with strength, it starts with vision. Not just what we see with our eyes, but how we see. Because the real battlefield isn't only out there, it's inside us. Between what we're told and what we believe. Between rules and instincts. Between what's expected and what's possible. Frank didn't save his crew because he had a better weapon. He saved them because he saw first, and he dared to trust what he saw, even when no one else did. In the end, the Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a test. And the periscope wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. Thinking differently isn't a flaw. It's survival. So maybe next time someone laughs at your idea, dismisses your invention, or tells you to stick to the manual, remember Frank Dawes. Lying on his stomach inside a Sherman, peering through an upside-down periscope, spotting a nightmare before it saw him. And maybe, just maybe, you'll build it anyway. What moved you most? The Panther, the periscope, or the wild idea that actually worked? Tell us in the comments below.